The night Frank Sinatra walked onto Johnny Carson's stage, nobody in that studio expected to witness the most devastating silence in the history of late-night television. But 90 seconds after Sinatra opened his mouth and mocked the most beloved song in the world, something happened that made the king of cool go completely pale. And what came after that silence changed both men forever, in ways that neither of them ever fully spoke about in public. This is the story of a single night, a joke that wasn't a joke, a silence that wasn't empty, and a revelation so raw, so unexpected, that the 300 people sitting in Studio One at NBC Burbank would talk about it for the rest of their lives. But before we go there, you need to understand something about the year this happened. Because the date matters, the timing matters, and what was happening in the world outside those studio doors was the invisible third character in everything that took place that night. It was November 1980, and the world was about to change in a way that nobody, not Frank Sinatra, not Johnny Carson, not the 28 million Americans who would watch that broadcast, was prepared for. November 14, 1980, NBC Studios, Burbank, California, 4:47 in the afternoon, Frank Sinatra arrived 2 hours early. This was not normal. Frank Sinatra did not arrive early for anything. Frank Sinatra arrived when Frank Sinatra decided to arrive, and the universe reorganized itself around that decision. His people called ahead. Makeup was ready. The green room was stocked exactly the way he required it, a specific brand of bourbon, a specific temperature in the room, no overhead lighting, a single lamp in the corner. These were not requests. These were conditions. But that afternoon, Frank Sinatra walked into NBC Studios at 4:47 p.m. for a show that didn't tape until 5:30, and he came alone. No entourage, no press coordinator, just Frank in a charcoal suit and the kind of expression that made his driver keep his eyes straight ahead on the entire ride over. The stage manager that afternoon was a man named Gerald Hoyt. Gerald had worked at The Tonight Show for 11 years. He had seen everything. He had seen arguments and breakdowns, and one occasion where a guest had needed to be quietly removed from the building before the cameras went on. Gerald Hoyt thought he was unshockable. Then he saw Frank Sinatra's face as the man walked through the backstage door, and Gerald felt something drop in his chest. Because Frank Sinatra looked like a man who was carrying something so heavy that even his famous posture was beginning to bend under the weight of it. Gerald showed him to the green room without a word. But what Gerald Hoyt didn't know, what nobody in that building knew yet, was what Frank Sinatra had been doing for the 3 weeks leading up to that night. And what he had been doing explained everything about the expression on his face, everything about what was about to happen when the cameras went live. Wait, do not miss this detail. 3 weeks before that broadcast, Frank Sinatra had received a phone call from a mutual friend in New York. The call was short. The message was simple. John Lennon had been spotted in Central Park. He was sitting on a bench, alone, playing a guitar quietly to himself while two young boys, strangers, kids from the neighborhood, sat nearby and listened. No entourage, no security, just John, the guitar, and the sound drifting across the November leaves. The person who told Frank this story had told it because they thought Frank would find it amusing, eccentric.
Before we continue our video, I'd like to say something. I often see comments from people who didn't realize they weren't subscribed. If you enjoy the channel, please take a second to check and make sure you're subscribed. It's free, and it really helps us keep the show growing. Thank you for being part of this journey with us.
Another piece of Lennon mythology to file away. Frank hadn't found it amusing. He'd hung up the phone and sat in his living room in Palm Springs for 45 minutes without moving. His wife came in twice. Both times he looked up and shook his head slightly, and she left without asking. Nobody knew what was happening inside Frank Sinatra's head that afternoon. But what you're about to discover is that it had everything to do with a song, a single, specific song, and the complicated, painful, unspoken war that had been living rent-free in Frank Sinatra's chest since the first time he heard it. To understand that night, you have to go back. Not far, just 9 years. Imagine was released in September of that year, and the world received it the way the world occasionally receives something that is almost too simple to argue with. The piano, the voice, the words that stripped away every defense a person had built against the idea of hope. Frank Sinatra heard it for the first time on a radio in Las Vegas. He was 55 years old. He had survived the mob, 3 marriages, a career collapse and resurrection, a Senate hearing, and 40 years of people telling him what he was and was not allowed to be. He was, by any measure, the most complete entertainer American popular music had ever produced. And when he heard Imagine for the first time, he turned the radio off and did not speak for 20 minutes. The people in the room assumed it was contempt. Frank had never hidden his skepticism about the Beatles. He thought their early music was thin. He thought the screaming was hysteria dressed up as art. He had said, in public and in private, things about rock and roll that were not designed to make friends. But what the people in that room didn't know, what nobody knew, was that when Frank turned off the radio in Las Vegas in 1971, it was not because the song made him angry. It was because the song made him feel something he didn't know what to do with. And Frank Sinatra had never in 55 years on this earth learned how to sit comfortably with a feeling he didn't know what to do with. Johnny Carson had known Frank Sinatra for 19 years by November of 1980. They were not close friends in the way that word is sometimes used loosely in Hollywood. They were something more specific and more valuable than that. They were two men who respected each other completely, who had watched each other operate at the highest possible level, and who had developed over nearly 2 decades of television appearances and chance encounters at industry events, the particular shorthand that exists only between people who have seen the same things from different angles. Johnny knew Frank, not everything, but enough, which is why, at 5:15 p.m., on November 14th, when Johnny's producer Fred de Cordova knocked on the dressing room door and said, "Johnny, Frank's here early and he's asking to go first tonight. He says he needs to talk about something." Johnny didn't ask why. He just nodded and changed the order of the show. Fred looked at him. "You're not going to ask what it's about?" Johnny was straightening his tie in the mirror. "Fred, if Frank Sinatra comes in 2 hours early and asks to go first, you don't ask what it's about. You say yes and you make sure the cameras are ready." Fred hesitated at the door. "Johnny, I've known him a long time. He doesn't look like himself tonight." Johnny met Fred's eyes in the mirror. "I know," he said quietly. "That's why we're not asking. What happened next has never been fully told until now." 5:30 p.m. the show begins. Johnny's monologue is sharp, perfectly calibrated. The audience is warm, leaning in. Election jokes. Reagan had won the presidency 2 weeks earlier, and the material writes itself. The laughs come in exactly the right places. From the outside, it is a perfect night of television. But Ed McMahon, sitting to Johnny's left for the 17th year, with the kind of knowledge that only 17 years can build, can see that Johnny's right hand is not still. It keeps returning to the desk, pressing flat, then lifting, pressing again. Ed has seen this exactly 3 times in 17 years. Each time it meant that something was coming that Johnny could not predict. Ed leans in during the first commercial. "Frank's really going first tonight?" he asked. "Did he say why?" Johnny looks at his notes. Then he closes the folder. "No." "And I didn't ask." Ed starts to say something else. But the commercial ends, and the night begins in earnest. At 5:52 p.m., Ed McMahon's voice fills the studio the way it always fills a studio, like a warm hand placed on a cold room. "Ladies and gentlemen, a man who needs absolutely no introduction. A man who has been making music, making history, and making it look easy for over 40 years. Please welcome Mr. Frank Sinatra." The audience rose before he even appeared. That is the only way to describe it. Not a standing ovation that builds from scattered applause. The entire studio on its feet before the man had taken a single step onto the stage. 300 people standing in the particular way people stand when they are in the presence of something they understand is not going to be repeated. Frank walked out. The suit was perfect. The hat was perfect. The smile, deployed at exactly the right moment toward exactly the right section of the audience, was perfect. He shook Johnny's hand. He sat down. He crossed one leg over the other and adjusted his cufflinks with the particular gesture that anyone who had ever watched Frank Sinatra in a chair would recognize. The audience sat. The room settled. Johnny leaned forward. "Frank, it's always a gift when you come in." "Johnny?" Frank's voice. Even on a bad night, even tired, even carrying whatever he was carrying that evening, that voice. "You're too kind, as always. You've got a new album," Johnny said. "We should talk about that. But first, I understand you wanted to say something tonight. Something on your mind. A beat." Frank looked at the audience, then at the camera, then back at Johnny. "I've been thinking," Frank said, "about a song." The audience settled into a slightly different quality of quiet. "Not one of mine," Frank continued, and there was a small laugh. "That would be too easy. I've been thinking about a song by someone I have spent," he paused, chose the word carefully, "considerable time disagreeing with." Johnny tilted his head, the famous slight tilt that meant he was listening in a different gear. "John Lennon," Frank said, and the studio shifted. But what happened next shocked everyone in that building. Because Frank Sinatra did not say what anyone expected him to say. "Imagine." Frank said the word the way you say the name of something you have been arguing with for 9 years and have finally decided to stop fighting. "Imagine." He said it again, quieter. "I want to be honest with you tonight, Johnny. And I want to be honest with America, because I think America deserves honesty more than it deserves performance, and I have been performing for so long that sometimes I confuse the two." He looked at the camera. "I said things about that song. In interviews, at dinner tables, in rooms where I thought nobody was writing anything down. I called it naive. I called it the kind of song that sounds profound to people who haven't lived long enough to know that the world doesn't work the way a piano ballad suggests it should." A murmur in the audience. "I was wrong." Complete silence. "Not about the naivety." Frank held up one finger. "That part I still believe. I am 64 years old, and I have seen enough of this world to know that it does not organize itself according to the wishes of songwriters, no matter how gifted." He paused. "But I was wrong about why he wrote it, and I was wrong about what it meant to the people who needed it." Johnny had not moved. His hands were flat on the desk. "There's a woman," Frank said. "I'm not going to tell you her name because she would kill me and she'd be right to do it. A woman I have known for 30 years, not a famous woman, not a Hollywood woman, a woman from New Jersey who worked in a laundry for most of her life and raised 4 kids after her husband left and never once asked anyone to feel sorry for her." He stopped. The way a man stops when he is deciding how much of himself to hand to a room full of strangers. Her son came back from Vietnam in 1969. Not the same boy who left. None of them came back the same. But this particular boy, he came back and he couldn't find his way back to the living. 2 years he was just present, breathing, taking up space in a world he didn't recognize anymore. The studio was as quiet as any room with 300 people in it can be, and then one day his mother found him in the kitchen, playing a record, sitting on the floor with his back against the cabinet, and this record was on, and he was crying. First time he had cried since he got home. First time she'd seen anything in his face that looked like the boy who left. Frank smoothed the leg of his trousers, a careful, deliberate gesture. The record was Imagine. Nobody breathed. She called me because she wanted to tell someone and she didn't know who else to call, and she knew I'd said things about that song in public. He looked at Johnny. She didn't call to make me feel bad. That's not who she is. She called to tell me that her son was going to be all right, and she thought I should know what helped. Johnny Carson's jaw was tight. His eyes were very bright. "I mocked that song," Frank said. "I stood in rooms full of people I was trying to impress, and I made clever remarks about a man who was trying to say something true, and I did it because I was scared of what the song made me feel, and I didn't know how to say that. So instead I said the song was naive." He looked down. "That was the naive thing, that was me, and that was the moment. That was the 90 seconds. Because after Frank Sinatra finished saying those words, nobody in that studio made a sound. Not a cough, not a shift in a chair. The orchestra had stopped warming up in the wings. The camera operator stood still. And for 94 seconds, a camera operator counted later, watching the tape, 300 people sat inside a silence that was not empty. It was full. It was the fullest silence any of them had ever sat inside. Because Frank Sinatra had just done the thing that Frank Sinatra never did. He had told the truth at his own expense. In public, on camera, to 28 million people. Johnny Carson, in 30 years of hosting, had never done what he did next. He reached across his desk and placed his hand over Frank Sinatra's hand. No words, no setup, no pivot to the next segment. He simply put his hand over Frank's hand and left it there. Frank looked down at it. Then he looked up at Johnny, and something moved across Frank Sinatra's face that the camera operator named Dale Hutchins would describe in an interview 30 years later as the only time he had ever seen Frank Sinatra look relieved. Not happy. Relieved. The specific expression of a person who has been holding something for a long time and has finally put it down. "Tell me about her son," Johnny said quietly. "Is he okay?" Frank nodded. "He is. He's got a family now. 3 kids. He coaches Little League on Saturdays." A short pause. "He still plays that record." The audience exhaled collectively, like a room deciding it was safe to breathe again. But what nobody in that studio knew, what Frank Sinatra himself did not yet know, was that 24 days later, something would happen in New York City that would make this conversation the most important thing Frank had ever said on television. Something that would land on this broadcast like a photograph landing on a wound. Something that would make the 28 million people who watched it go back and watch it again and understand it differently. Understand it the only way human beings understand things that matter. Backwards, through grief, looking at what was said before the thing happened. Do not stop watching, because the story is not finished. Not even close. After the show, they sat in Johnny's dressing room for an hour. Frank and Johnny, 2 glasses of bourbon, the door closed. The producer knocked once. Johnny said, "Through the door, not tonight, Fred." And Fred, who had seen everything in 30 years of television, walked back to his office without another word. What they said in that room has never been recorded. But Gerald Hoyt, the stage manager who was locking up the prop room at the end of the corridor, heard, through two closed doors, the sound of Frank Sinatra laughing. Not the performance laugh, not the Las Vegas laugh that was designed to fill a room and make everyone inside it feel like they were part of something exclusive. The other laugh, the quiet one. The one that sounds like a person laughing at something that's both funny and sad. The kind of laugh that only comes out when the mask is down and nobody's watching. Gerald Hoyt said, in a 2001 interview for a small film archive that almost nobody read, that he stood in that corridor for about 30 seconds listening to that sound. And it was without question the most moving thing he witnessed in 11 years at The Tonight Show. He did not know what they were talking about. He didn't need to. 24 days later, December 8, 1980. John Lennon was shot outside his apartment building at the Dakota in New York City. He was 40 years old. The news moved through the country like something physical, like a sound that didn't need speakers. People heard it in the specific way that people hear things that rearrange the furniture of their understanding, silently, internally, in a place where the rearrangement shows up later, hours or days later, as a different kind of heaviness. Johnny Carson was in his Tonight Show office when the call came in. His assistant knocked on the door. The look on her face made him put down his coffee. He listened. He said nothing. He set the phone down carefully, the way you set something down when your hands aren't entirely steady. The show that night was already scheduled. Johnny was expected to be on, to be Johnny, to be the comfortable, familiar face that America came to at the end of difficult days. He went on. He did not open with a monologue. He sat down at his desk, looked at the camera, and said, "I don't think jokes are the right thing tonight. I think tonight, we just sit with it for a minute." He sat. The audience sat. Nobody spoke for 40 seconds. Then Johnny said, "A few weeks ago, a friend of mine sat in that chair and said something about a song that I've been thinking about ever since. He said that sometimes we mock the things that move us because we don't know what to do with being moved, and that being honest about that is braver than any performance." He paused. I think John Lennon would have understood that. I think John Lennon spent his whole life trying to say true things and accepting that some people would never forgive him for it. He looked at his hands on the desk. "Tonight, I just want to say that the world is less than it was this morning, and that Imagine is playing in my head right now, and I am not mocking it. I am grateful for it." He looked up. "I think Frank Sinatra would want me to say that." Frank Sinatra heard about John Lennon's death from his housekeeper, who knocked on the bedroom door at 6:30 a.m. Pacific time. She told him quietly. He thanked her. He asked to be left alone. He stayed in his bedroom for 4 hours. His wife checked on him twice. Both times he was sitting in the chair by the window, not reading, not watching television, not doing anything that could be described as an activity, just sitting, looking at something outside the window that wasn't quite the garden. When he finally came out at 10:30 a.m., he went to his piano, the one in the room off the hallway that was used for exactly this purpose, for the working out of things that needed music to be worked out, and he sat down and played one song. The staff said it took him 3 attempts to get through it without stopping. By the 4th time, he played it straight through, quietly, with only the piano, no accompaniment, no performance, no audience. The recording that exists of that session was found in his personal effects after his own death in 1998. It is 18 years between that November morning and the end of Frank Sinatra's life, and in those 18 years he spoke publicly about John Lennon exactly once, in a 1994 interview in which he said, "With the simplicity of a man who has made his peace with something, he was a great artist. Greater than I said he was. For most of the time I was saying things. I regret that." The interviewer asked if he had any specific regret. "Yes," Frank said. "I wish I'd said it to him." The broadcast from November 14, 1980, the one where Frank Sinatra sat on Johnny Carson's stage and admitted, on live national television, that he had been wrong, was not widely discussed in the weeks immediately following. The entertainment press gave it a paragraph. The music press gave it a column inch. Frank Sinatra admitting anything was not, in itself, news. Frank Sinatra was 64 years old and had been giving interviews for 40 years. People said things in interviews. But then December 8th happened, and the broadcast from November 14th became something different. It became a document, a thing you go back to and watch when the thing that comes after requires a before. 28 million people had watched it in real time. In the weeks after Lennon's death, it was replayed so many times that NBC received letters from viewers asking for transcripts. The switchboard was overwhelmed not with calls about Frank Sinatra, but with calls from people who wanted to talk about the woman from New Jersey, about her son on the kitchen floor, about the record that was playing. Mental health counselors across the country reported something specific in the calls they received in December 1980, people who referenced the Frank Sinatra broadcast as a reason they had decided to speak up about something they had been too proud to admit. Men specifically, men who had mocked things they were moved by, who had confused performance with strength, who had been carrying the weight of their own unspoken feeling for long enough that hearing Frank Sinatra name it had given them, somehow, the particular permission they needed. Johnny Carson said, in an interview conducted shortly before his retirement in 1992, that the November 14th broadcast was one of 3 broadcasts from his entire 30-year career that he would point to as the most important work he had ever done. He did not explain what the other 2 were. The interviewer asked what made that night different. Frank came in, Johnny said, and he was willing to be wrong in public. Which sounds simple, but most people, in most rooms, in most situations, would rather be right in private than wrong in public. Frank reversed that. And I think a lot of people watching that night felt something shift in them because of it. He paused. Imagine had just lost the man who wrote it, and 30 days earlier the man who had been most publicly skeptical about it had gone on television and said it was a great song, not because someone made him, not because it was good publicity, because a woman called him from New Jersey about her son. Johnny looked at his hands. That's what changes things. Not grand gestures, not headlines, a phone call from New Jersey. A woman who just wanted someone to know her son was going to be all right. There is one more thing. It was found in Frank Sinatra's personal files after his death in 1998. A single index card, handwritten in his own hand, not dated but placed in a folder marked simply with the letter J. On one side of the card was a phone number, a New Jersey area code, a number that was traced later to a laundry service in Hoboken that had been closed since the mid-1980s. On the other side of the card, in Frank Sinatra's handwriting, were 5 words. She was right. Tell Johnny. Whether he ever told Johnny, nobody knows. Whether Johnny ever received a private version of what Frank had said publicly that November night, no record exists. But there are 2 men who sat in a dressing room with the door closed for an hour after that broadcast, with bourbon and no cameras and nothing to perform for. And somewhere in that room, in that hour, the truth got said properly. That's what the job is actually for. That's what both of them knew. That's what the silence was full of. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that the things we mock are sometimes the things we are most afraid to need, share it. Share it with someone who's been too proud to say they were wrong. Share it with someone who's been carrying a feeling they don't know what to do with. Share it with someone who needs to hear that the bravest thing any of us can do is say simply, in whatever room we happen to be standing in, I was wrong. And I am grateful. Subscribe. And drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. Because this story is landing somewhere right now in someone who needed to hear it, and we want to know where the truth is landing tonight. Disclaimer: this story is a work of narrative fiction created for entertainment purposes. While inspired by real public figures and historical settings, all events, dialogue, and interactions are imagined and do not depict real interviews or documented occurrences. Any resemblance to actual events or private conversations is purely fictional.